Harsh, so clearly, I mean, the transformation in financial sector is so linked to technology. So one can imagine how technology plays and what kind of a role technology plays in the economic growth and transformation in the larger scheme of things as well. And not a lot of people, like you said, realize that India's payment systems or India's digital services, a lot of them are not just on par with the world, but they're actually leading in many ways. So can you tell us more about these innovations and also more broadly about how technology matters in the India growth story?
See, I think what happened is, this is a classic case of inertia of existing good systems. So the American financial system is good enough. Obviously, it's the world's richest economy. But for example, when I was living in Houston, it was just a pain to open a bank account and make small transfers. Really, the websites were from a different era altogether. This is like as late as 4 years ago, right? And of course, there is now Venmo and other apps, but even PayPal is not as innovative as many of Indian apps are. So what happens is when you start from a low base, technology allows you to leapfrog. So it's not necessarily that Indians are better. It's just that you just don't have to unlearn some things. Okay. In fact, in many ways, Indian regulators have been too conservative, I would say, because if you remember, payments through cell phones actually took off, maybe not to this volume, even earlier in parts of Africa, like in Kenya and, like this, the Vodafone, this ePay, I'm forgetting the name of the product.
M-Pesa or something.
M-Pesa and all that, right? They just kind of boomed in Africa because they had an even more underdeveloped infrastructure. Now, I'm not saying regulators should allow everything. They have to be careful, but in some ways, if you want to do a counterfactual analysis, who knows how much more development could have happened in India already had the regulators been perhaps a bit more open-minded. And of course, I'm sure that's changing to some extent. So I think that's on the financial side. Really, the biggest benefit that we had was we decided we can leapfrog, and the pipelines, the basic utilities, we will not keep that for profit. That we will, it's like if you want to privatize, you privatize slots on the railway. You don't privatize the railway line itself, right? The basic infrastructure you keep, because that's how the economics work. Otherwise, it's very easy to monopolize. So I think that's on the financial side. I think more broadly, technology is extremely important, both endogenously and exogenously. What I mean by that is, of course, India being on a per capita basis poor, although with a industrial, technological, and financial elite that's increasingly on par with the world, but most of the population being very poor by global standards, a lot of the technology is all about absorbing the already big gap. But at the same time, because it's such a big market in an aggregate basis, not on a per capita basis, there's a lot of frugal engineering happening, right? Which is not just jugaad. Jugaad is not necessarily systematic, but something much more. So often what started with BPOs in India for multinationals then became KPOs, now became GCCs. And now a lot of entrepreneurs are spinning off from those back offices and then mid offices and then research and development offices that all these companies have in Bangalore and Hyderabad and Pune and Gurgaon, right? So, and entrepreneurs come out of that. So I think that human talent is there, the market is there, the leapfrogging is there. But on technology more broadly, see, technology can be broken into two buckets. So one is, I would simply say, some people call it bits and bytes, right? I mean, in a sense that bytes are data, even though bits are data as well, but bits are like physical bits. So there is physical stuff which moves by energy, and there is data/communication. So in many ways, actually, the world at large over the last half century, I think man last went to the moon in 1972, if I'm not wrong. In the last 50 years has been about globalization and about assimilation or diffusion of existing technologies, many of which were formed during World War II and Cold War. And then civilian applications were democratized across the world, with, of course, the United States of America playing a large part in it for its own selfish commercial and geopolitical reasons. But for whatever reasons, they've created that contribution. Now what we are seeing is, in a way, while the data story will continue, right, with 5G, now augmented reality and virtual reality, which will be huge for India, because if you and I can have an even better chat, right, it's almost like if Kamal is sitting in front of me, then it's not just a podcast. We could work like this every day almost. again, human touch is there, all that is there. But then, and if we could talk like that, then you could be in Boston and I could be in Bangalore, right? So far, blue collar jobs have been outsourced. Relatively few white collar jobs have been outsourced from the West, right? Because they have been mostly back office and some mid office jobs. But imagine if distance really becomes much less relevant. It will never fully happen. There will never be a completely flat world. There's always geopolitics and trade policy, but technology matters, and that will lead to a massive further exploitation for India's benefit of that labor arbitrage. So that's on the data side. And of course, within India itself, you could also go to smaller towns. You don't have to be in South Bombay or South Bangalore or South Delhi or Gurgaon. The other part, which I think is very interesting, is ultimately growth is about energy, right? I mean, moving stuff and people from point A to point B. Right. That's historically been a huge part. In many ways, the Industrial Revolution was because of coal, right? The second Industrial Revolution was because of oil, right? Third Industrial Revolution was nuclear and electricity and so on and so forth. Because of climate reasons, because of other geopolitical reasons, we are at a point where we are at the precipice of cheap energy, right? Solar, wind plus battery, not to mention the comeback of nuclear. Right. That combination together can lead to much cheaper energy in, say, another 10 years from now, maybe at half the cost, even cheaper than natural gas. And when I say cheaper than natural gas, I mean cheaper than natural gas at North American prices. By the time they land in Asia, it's already more expensive. It comes via Australia or the LNG or whatever. So really, really cheap energy, dramatically reduces India's import costs, if not in absolute terms, but in terms of percentage of GDP, because India is one of the few emerging markets which is not a commodity play. It's actually an anti-commodity play. India is a human capital story. It's not a commodity story. It's not a Brazil or Russia. It's not even a less poor form of Australia or Canada, right? It's a human capital story. So for us, falling of energy costs is an absolute boom. Right. And that's actually what the world is focusing on. Yeah. From German subsidies to Chinese subsidies to American subsidies to Indian PLI schemes now. Yeah. So the falling cost of energy is a big tailwind for the India story. It's a big tailwind for humanity. Yeah. It's a double tailwind for India. Yeah. So that energy story, now hydrogen is being added to it. So hydrogen and solar and wind and storage and nuclear on the energy side. On the data side, I mentioned 5G, AR, VR, and then of course the financial and the broader startup ecosystem that we discussed. So these are things which ultimately will make, travel, transportation from point A to point B easy. Right now, it seems difficult and even stupid to say that because we're living through a temporary energy spike phase in the last few months. But the long-term trend is very clear, like commodity and energy prices fall, especially as a percentage of global GDP over very long periods. Right. That basically is the story of growth, because then you have more stuff left for consumption, luxury, discretion, and more importantly, reinvesting in the rest of humanity for future growth. So I think those two are basically at the precipice of acceleration. And that's why I'm especially more bullish for India, which starts from a low base, but has the basic infrastructure in an institutional sense to mostly exploit it, not fully exploited, to mostly exploit it. Africa is also starting from a very low base, but it does not have that population density. It is not one country, although an African Free Trade Union was recently signed, Nigeria signing at the last moment. And then their demographic transition is further couple of decades behind. So parts of Africa, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Middle East and Muslim world, I'm sure eventually they'll also join the story, but those are broader social political changes which will also have to take place in the end. India seems to be, despite various problems, at that right point right now.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.